The thermometer outside John Parker's cabin window shattered that morning. At minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit, even the most resilient equipment surrendered to Alaska's merciless winter. The mercury simply froze, expanded, and broke through its glass prison, leaving John with one less tool to measure just how deadly the outside world had become. John had spent 15 years in this remote cabin, 40 miles from the nearest town of Coldfoot. As a wildlife photographer, he had chosen this isolation, finding beauty in the untamed wilderness that most people only saw in magazines. His photos of bears, wolves, and moose had graced the covers of National Geographic 3 times. But in all his years in the Alaskan wilderness, he had never witnessed a winter quite like this one. The wind howled outside like a wounded animal, hurling snow against his cabin walls with such force that the thick logs groaned under the assault. Through his frost-covered windows, the world had disappeared into a white void. The spruce trees, usually visible from his porch, were now just dark shadows in the swirling chaos of the blizzard. Inside, John maintained his routine with military precision. The fireplace crackled with a fresh load of wood, carefully rationed from his dwindling supply in the storage room. His satellite phone lay charged on the table, his only lifeline to civilization. Though in weather like this, rescue would be impossible even if he needed it. The pantry was well stocked with canned goods and dried meat, enough to last another month if necessary. Every morning, despite the brutal conditions, John performed his surroundings check. It was a habit born from years of experience and more than a few close calls with the wilderness. He would put on 4 layers of clothing, each carefully selected to trap heat while allowing movement. His outer layer, a thick parka rated for extreme conditions, had saved his life more times than he cared to count. Through the small windows of his cabin, he methodically scanned the perimeter. First the north side, where his generator hummed beneath its protective shelter. Then east, toward the supply shed. South, where his backup water tank stood. Finally west, where his garage workshop connected to the main cabin. This building had saved his life last winter when a storm trapped him while he was maintaining his snowmobile. The storm had begun 3 days ago, and according to his satellite weather updates, it showed no signs of weakening. This morning, something felt different. The air had an unusual stillness despite the raging storm, a quality John had learned to notice during his years in the wild. Nature had a way of warning those who knew how to listen, and today it was screaming that something was about to happen. As John finished his morning coffee, a sound cut through the howling wind, something he had never heard in all his years in the wilderness, a sound that made him question his own sanity. It was not the typical growl of a predator or the cry of a hunting wolf. It was something more deliberate, more desperate. A scratching noise came from his front door, followed by what sounded like a whimper. But this was no ordinary whimper. It was deep, powerful, and carried the unmistakable weight of something massive. John's hand instinctively moved toward his rifle, always kept loaded during winter storms when desperate predators sometimes sought shelter. The sound came again, this time accompanied by a thud that made his heavy wooden door shudder. Whatever was outside was not simply passing by, it was trying to get his attention. As John reached for the door handle, his years of experience screamed at him to stop. But something else, something he could not explain, urged him to open it. Little did John know his next decision would challenge everything he thought he knew about wildlife and survival in the Alaskan wilderness. The door creaked open against the force of the wind, letting in a blast of snow and Arctic air that instantly dropped the cabin's temperature. Through the swirling white chaos, John found himself face to face with a massive grizzly bear. The animal stood on its hind legs, towering over 8 feet tall, its thick brown fur crusted with ice and snow. John's heart thundered in his chest. His fingers tightened around his rifle, but something stopped him from raising it. The bear's eyes held none of the aggression he had witnessed in countless encounters throughout his career. Instead, they were filled with an almost human-like desperation. The bear swayed unsteadily on its feet, clearly exhausted. Its breath came out in labored clouds of steam, and its movements were sluggish. John noticed patches of ice matted into its fur, and its usually robust frame showed signs of winter weight loss. But what struck him most was its behavior. Instead of charging or showing aggression, The bear lowered its massive head and made a sound that could only be described as a plea. Years of experience had taught John that predators, especially bears, became unpredictable when desperate. During particularly harsh winters, he had seen them break into storage sheds and even attempt to enter homes. But this was different. The bear kept looking back over its shoulder into the storm, then returning its gaze to John, as if trying to communicate something. The bear dropped back to all fours and took a few steps backward, then looked at John expectantly. When he didn't move, it repeated the motion, this time adding a soft grunt. It was clearly asking him to follow. Every survival instinct John had developed over 15 years in the wilderness screamed at him to close the door and wait for the bear to leave. But his photographer's intuition, the same sixth sense that had helped him capture some of his most remarkable wildlife shots, told him this was something extraordinary. The bear's behavior defied everything he knew about grizzly bears. They should be in hibernation during winter, not seeking human contact. Something was terribly wrong. John's mind raced through possible explanations. Disease, injury, territory dispute with another predator. None of these explained the bear's almost gentle demeanor. He had photographed hundreds of bears over the years, documenting their behavior in every season. He had never seen anything like this. The wind howled louder, and the bear stumbled slightly, catching itself against the driving snow. Its fur, designed to protect against the harshest conditions, was failing against this unprecedented cold. Without shelter, the animal would not survive the night. John knew this with certainty, just as he knew that helping a wild grizzly bear was probably the most foolish thing he could do. His fingers traced the scar on his left arm, a permanent reminder of his last close encounter with a grizzly 5 years ago. That had been a female protecting her cubs, and he had barely made it back to his cabin. This situation felt eerily similar, yet completely different. The bear made another sound, softer this time, almost a whimper. It took another unsteady step toward the garage workshop, looking back at John with those eerily intelligent eyes. In 15 years of wildlife photography, he had learned that animals, especially the large predators, had intelligence that most people failed to recognize. But this was something beyond simple animal intelligence. John found himself facing an impossible choice. Everything he knew about survival in the wilderness told him to close the door and let nature take its course. But something deeper, perhaps the same instinct that had drawn him to wildlife photography in the first place, urged him to help. The bear swayed again, more severely this time. In the brutal cold and wind, its strength was clearly fading. John knew he had only moments to make his decision. Either he would help this massive predator and risk his own life, or he would close the door and likely condemn the animal to death in the storm. The bear's eyes met his one more time, and in that moment, John made his choice. John slowly reached for the garage workshop keys hanging by the door. The bear watched his every movement, its massive body trembling against the relentless wind. Ice crystals had formed around its nose and eyes, a clear sign of dangerous exposure. Even a creature as mighty as a grizzly bear could not withstand nature's fury forever. Moving with deliberate slowness, John stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath away. The bear remained surprisingly calm, maintaining a respectful distance as John made his way to the garage workshop door. His fingers, despite the thick gloves, felt numb as he worked the frozen lock. The workshop was unheated but insulated, used for maintaining his snowmobiles and storing photography equipment. Most importantly, it had a separate entrance from his main cabin and a solid door he could close between them. If things went wrong, he would at least have a barrier between himself and the bear. The door finally creaked open, protesting against the ice that had formed in its hinges. John switched on the lights, illuminating the spacious interior. Tools lined the walls, and his snowmobile sat in the corner, covered with a tarp. The bear watched intently as John cleared a space, pushing equipment against the walls to create a safe area. Every movement felt like walking through a dream. Here he was, a wildlife photographer who had spent years teaching others about maintaining safe distances from predators, deliberately inviting one of the most dangerous animals in North America into his shelter. The irony was not lost on him. John stepped aside, gesturing toward the open door. The bear understood immediately. It moved forward with surprising gentleness for a creature its size, carefully maneuvering its bulk through the doorway. Its fur brushed against John's parka, and he could smell its wild, musky scent mixed with the sharp bite of snow and ice. Inside the workshop, the bear seemed to grow even larger. Its shoulders nearly brushed the ceiling as it investigated its new surroundings. John's heart raced as he realized just how massive the animal truly was. One swipe of those paws could end his life instantly, yet the bear's movements remained cautious, almost delicate, as if aware of its size and power. John quickly grabbed several old moving blankets from a shelf, careful to keep the bear in his peripheral vision. The animal watched him but made no aggressive moves. Instead, it kept looking toward a corner of the workshop, the same anxious behavior it had displayed outside. The temperature in the workshop, while far warmer than outside, was still well below freezing. John knew he needed to provide some form of heat. The small electric space heater on his workbench might help, but he would need to approach the bear to plug it in. Moving slowly, John reached for the heater. The bear tracked his movements but remained still, its breath coming in heavy clouds. As he plugged in the heater, its soft hum filled the workshop. The bear's ears twitched at the sound but showed no sign of distress. John backed toward the door connecting to his cabin, never taking his eyes off his enormous guest. The bear had settled in the corner, still alert but showing signs of exhaustion. As John prepared to close the door between them, the bear made that same pleading sound from earlier, somehow more urgent now. Something in that sound made John pause. There was more to this situation than a bear seeking shelter from a storm. Something was hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be revealed. The bear's pleading sounds grew more insistent as John prepared to leave the workshop. Its behavior became increasingly agitated, not with aggression, but with what appeared to be anxiety. The massive creature kept looking back at him, then down at its own body, repeating this motion with growing urgency. John noticed something odd about the way the bear was positioned. Despite its obvious exhaustion, it had not fully settled onto the workshop floor. Instead, it maintained an awkward, slightly raised posture, as if hovering over something. The realization struck him that the bear was not just seeking shelter, it was protecting something. Trusting his instincts that had served him well through countless wildlife encounters, John retrieved a powerful flashlight from his workbench. The bear watched him intently but made no move to stop him as he slowly approached. As the beam of light cut through the workshop's shadows, John heard a sound that made him question his sanity. A tiny whimper, but not from the bear. There, beneath the massive body of the grizzly, were three small gray bundles of fur. Wolf cubs, no more than a few weeks old, huddled together for warmth. Their eyes were barely open, their tiny bodies trembling, despite the shelter of the bear's fur. The sight was so impossible that John found himself blinking repeatedly, certain he must be hallucinating. The bear shifted slightly, allowing him a better view of the cubs. They were desperately malnourished, their small frames showing signs of the harsh winter's toll. But they were alive, protected by the most unlikely guardian imaginable. A grizzly bear, a natural predator of wolves, had somehow become their protector. John's mind raced to make sense of what he was seeing. He had documented countless interactions between bears and wolves over the years, most of them violent confrontations over territory or food. Never in his wildest dreams had he imagined witnessing something like this. The bear must have found the cubs perhaps after their mother had been killed or had abandoned them in the brutal storm. The largest cub attempted to crawl toward the bear's head, its movements weak and uncoordinated. The bear responded with a gentleness that seemed impossible for its massive size, carefully nudging the cub back toward its siblings with its snout. The tender interaction brought tears to John's eyes, which quickly froze in the cold air. Now the bear's desperate behavior made perfect sense. It had not just been seeking shelter for itself, but for these helpless cubs. The storm would have meant certain death for the tiny wolves, and somehow this grizzly had understood that human help was their only chance for survival. The intelligence and compassion displayed by this wild creature challenged everything John thought he knew about the natural world. The bear's eyes met John's again, but this time he saw something new in them. Trust mixed with a silent plea for help. This massive predator, capable of tearing him apart with a single swipe, was entrusting him with the lives of these vulnerable cubs. The responsibility felt enormous, almost overwhelming. One of the cubs let out another weak whimper, and John knew time was critical. These tiny creatures needed warmth and nourishment immediately. The bear had done something extraordinary in bringing them here, defying both its natural instincts and the normal boundaries between wildlife and humans. Now it was up to John to honor that trust and help this unlikely family survive. As he backed away to gather supplies from his cabin, John realized he was witnessing something that would change his understanding of wildlife forever. This was not just about survival anymore. It was about the profound capacity for compassion that could exist in the animal world, crossing the boundaries between species and challenging human assumptions about the limitations of wild creatures. In the hours that followed, John witnessed a side of wildlife that few humans had ever seen. The bear maintained its protective position over the cubs, but allowed John to approach with supplies. He brought warm milk mixed with protein powder, a formula he had once used to feed orphan fox kits he had rehabilitated years ago. The first feeding was a delicate operation. John warmed the bottles in a pot of hot water he had brought from the cabin, testing the temperature carefully. The bear watched his every movement but showed no signs of aggression. Instead, it seemed to understand his intentions, shifting slightly to allow him better access to the cubs. Each tiny wolf cub required careful handling. They were so weak they could barely suckle at first, but John had experience with wildlife rehabilitation. He gently supported their heads, watching as they gradually gained strength with each swallow. The bear observed the entire process with an almost motherly attention, occasionally leaning forward to nuzzle a cub that was struggling. As the days passed, John established a routine. Every few hours, he would prepare fresh bottles and check on his unusual guests. The bear began to recognize the sound of his approach, lifting its head expectantly when he entered the workshop. The space heater worked continuously, creating a warm sanctuary from the relentless storm that still raged outside. The bear's own condition needed attention too. John brought water and food, placing large bowls of high-protein, dog food mixed with honey and fish oil within easy reach. The bear ate gratefully but delicately, always keeping part of its body sheltering the cubs. Its manners were surprisingly refined for such a powerful predator, and John found himself talking softly to it as he worked. By the third day, the wolf cubs showed remarkable improvement. Their eyes were brighter, their movements stronger. They began to crawl with more purpose, always under the watchful eyes of both the bear and John. The bear would gently guide them back when they strayed too far, using its snout with incredible gentleness to nudge them into safer positions. What amazed John most was how the bear seemed to share parenting duties with him. When he arrived with bottles, the bear would help position the cubs for feeding. If a cub was struggling, the bear would gently prod it toward John's waiting hands. This level of cooperation between human and wild predator was unprecedented in his experience. The trust between them grew stronger with each passing day. John no longer felt the need to watch the bear's every movement for signs of aggression. The bear in turn became comfortable enough to sleep while John was present, though always maintaining protective contact with the cubs. He found himself spending hours in the workshop, photographing this extraordinary relationship with the camera he always kept nearby. One particularly memorable moment came when one of the cubs, the smallest of the three, began to falter during feeding. The bear noticed immediately, making a soft sound of distress. John instinctively began massaging the cub's tiny body, a technique he had used with other struggling wildlife. The bear watched intently, and when the cub began to respond, let out a gentle rumble that seemed to express relief. As John worked to save these 4 lives, he realized that something profound was happening. The boundaries between human and wild animal, predator and prey, were dissolving in this workshop. The bear, a creature he had photographed hundreds of times from a safe distance, was now a partner in this unlikely rescue mission. Sometimes in the quiet moments between feedings, John would sit on his workbench and marvel at the scene before him. A grizzly bear, one of nature's most fearsome predators, gentling caring for wolf cubs, natural enemies of its kind. And here he was, a human, accepted as part of this extraordinary family. It was a reminder that nature held mysteries that went far beyond scientific understanding. The blizzard showed no signs of weakening as days turned into a week. Managing the needs of his unusual guests became John's entire world. His workshop had transformed into a makeshift wildlife sanctuary, with feeding schedules marked on his phone and supplies carefully organized for maximum efficiency. Every morning brought new challenges. The cubs required feeding every 4 hours, and their appetites grew stronger as they recovered. John found himself mixing larger batches of formula, carefully adjusting the recipe as they developed. His supply of milk powder and protein supplements began to dwindle, forcing him to carefully ration what remained. The bear's presence created its own set of complications. A full-grown grizzly consumed enormous amounts of food, and John's stored supplies were not meant to sustain such a large animal. He began combining his emergency food stores with thawed fish from his freezer, supplementing with the high-protein dog food he kept for occasional strays. The bear ate with surprising restraint, as if understanding the need to conserve resources. Temperature control became another constant concern. The workshop's insulation helped, but maintaining warmth required careful management of his generator's fuel. John found himself constantly monitoring the space heater's position, adjusting it to provide maximum benefit to both the cubs and the bear while conserving electricity. At night, he would add extra blankets, watching as the bear would carefully arrange them around the cubs with its massive paws. The waste management situation proved particularly challenging. Wild animals, especially large predators, were not meant to live in enclosed spaces. John developed a system of cleaning and sanitizing that had to be performed several times daily. The bear seemed to understand the necessity of cleanliness, keeping the cubs away from soiled areas and cooperating with John's cleaning efforts. Space in the workshop became increasingly cramped as the cubs grew stronger and more active. They began to explore their surroundings, their natural wolf curiosity emerging as their health improved. The bear watched their adventures vigilantly, while John found himself constantly moving tools and equipment to higher shelves, creating a safer environment for the energetic cubs. His satellite phone became a lifeline as he consulted with wildlife veterinarians, carefully avoiding mention of the bear's presence while seeking advice about the cubs' care. Each conversation required creative explanations about his situation, as few would believe the truth of what was happening in his workshop. Sleep became a luxury John could barely afford. The cubs' feeding schedule meant he was up multiple times during the night, trudging through the snow between his cabin and the workshop. He began keeping a cot in the corner, catching short naps between feedings, while the bear stood guard over their shared charges. The storm's intensity meant no one could reach his location, even if he had wanted to reveal his situation to authorities. John knew that housing wild animals, particularly predators, violated numerous wildlife regulations. Yet the extraordinary circumstances and the unique bond he witnessed between the bear and cubs convinced him he had made the right choice. During quiet moments, John documented everything with his camera, the bear allowing him to check the cub's health, the careful way it would groom each cub with its tongue, the gentle rumbles it made when the cubs were restless. These images captured a story that challenged everything known about wildlife behavior, though he knew sharing them might bring unwanted attention to his actions. As the week drew to a close, John realized that his greatest challenge lay ahead. Eventually, the storm would pass. When it did, he would face difficult decisions about the future of this unlikely family he had helped create. After 9 days, the howling wind finally ceased. The sudden silence woke John from his short nap on the workshop cot. Through the small window, bright sunlight reflected off the pristine snow, marking the storm's end. This moment of peace brought with it the weight of decisions he had been avoiding. The cubs had flourished under their shared care. All three now moved with strength and purpose, their playful nature emerging more each day. They had begun eating small amounts of solid food, another sign that they were ready for the next phase of their lives. The smallest one, which John had privately named Shadow, had grown particularly attached to both its unlikely guardians. The bear, too, had recovered its strength. Its fur had regained its healthy shine, and its movements showed the power and grace that had been dampened by exhaustion when it first arrived. Yet it made no attempt to leave when John opened the workshop door to let in fresh air. Instead, it gathered the cubs closer, watching the outside world with cautious eyes. John knew the scientific arguments against keeping wild animals in captivity. His years of wildlife photography had taught him that animals belonged in their natural habitat. But as he watched the bear gently nudge the cubs into a playful tumble, He questioned whether traditional wildlife management wisdom applied to this extraordinary situation. The weather report on his satellite phone predicted clear skies for the coming week. The temperature had risen to a manageable -20, practically warm by Alaskan winter standards. Nature was offering them a window of opportunity, but the timing felt cruel. The cubs were still too young to survive in the wild without protection. As John stood in the doorway, contemplating their options, the bear made the decision for them. It rose to its full height, carefully checking each cub with gentle touches of its snout. Then it looked at John with those intelligent eyes that had first convinced him to help. He understood the message. It was time. John packed supplies for their journey, a bag of dog food for the bear, extra formula for the cubs, and emergency provisions in case they needed to seek shelter again. He knew following them would violate every wildlife protocol he had ever learned, but he had long since passed the point of conventional wildlife management. The bear led its small family out into the bright afternoon sun. The cubs stuck close to its massive legs, experiencing snow for the first time since their rescue. Their excitement was visible as they sniffed and pawed at the white expanse, always under the bear's watchful eye. To John's surprise, the bear waited for him. It stood patiently as he shouldered his supply pack and camera, then began walking slowly toward the tree line. The cubs bounded through the snow behind it, with John bringing up the rear of their unusual procession. He recognized the direction. The bear was heading toward a network of caves he had photographed the previous summer. The journey took several hours, with frequent stops to rest and feed the cubs. The bear chose their path carefully, avoiding deep snow and dangerous terrain. John documented their progress with his camera, knowing these images might never be shared, but needing to preserve this extraordinary experience. At the cave entrance, the bear turned to face John one final time. Its eyes held the same intelligence and trust that had marked their entire unlikely partnership. The cubs romped nearby, already exploring their new home. In that moment, John understood that while their paths would now diverge, their connection would remain. With a gentle rumble, the bear gathered its adopted wolf family and disappeared into the cave. John stood watching long after they vanished from sight, his camera hanging forgotten at his side. The sun began to set, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold, as if nature itself was marking the end of this remarkable chapter. Spring arrived in Alaska with its usual symphony of melting ice and returning birds. John found himself spending more time outside his cabin, camera in hand, his eyes constantly drawn to the distant caves. The experience of that winter storm had changed him in profound ways, altering how he viewed the relationship between humans and wildlife. His photos from those 9 extraordinary days remain private, stored on a separate hard drive. The world might not be ready for evidence that challenged everything known about natural enemies and survival instincts. Yet the memory of a grizzly bear tenderly caring for wolf cubs remained vivid in his mind, a reminder that nature held mysteries beyond human understanding. The first sign came on a mild April morning. John was chopping wood when he noticed movement at the forest edge. There stood the bear, instantly recognizable by a distinctive marking on its right shoulder. Behind it, 3 young wolves played in the remaining patches of snow. They had grown significantly, their bodies strong and healthy, but they still stayed close to their unlikely guardian. These visits became a pattern. Every few weeks, the unusual family would appear near his cabin. The bear would keep a respectful distance, but its presence felt like a deliberate greeting. The wolves, now nearly full-grown, showed none of the usual aggression their species typically displayed toward humans. Instead, they would watch John with the same intelligent curiosity he remembered from their days as cubs. John began leaving small offerings during these visits, a bowl of honey for the bear, some fish for the wolves. He never approached them directly, respecting their return to wildlife, but maintained this gentle connection. Sometimes he would talk softly to them, sharing news of his day while they listened with surprising attention. The story changed how John approached his wildlife photography. His images began capturing moments of unexpected cooperation between species, quiet instances of animals displaying emotions humans had long denied them capable of feeling. His work gained new depth, showing the natural world not just as a stage for survival, but as a complex web of relationships and possibilities. Other photographers and naturalists noticed the change in his work, though none knew its source. His photos began winning awards not just for their technical excellence, but for their ability to reveal the emotional lives of wild creatures. When asked about his inspiration, John would simply smile and say he had learned to see animals differently during a long winter storm. Years passed, but the bear and wolves continued their occasional visits, though less frequently as time went on. The cubs, now full-grown wolves, had formed their own pack, but maintained their unusual alliance with the bear. Local hunters reported seeing a grizzly and wolf pack hunting together, sharing kills in defiance of every known law of nature. John knew better than to explain why. What remained with John most strongly was not just the miracle of that winter rescue, but the lesson it taught about compassion's power to transcend boundaries. A grizzly bear had chosen to save wolf cubs, traditional enemies of its kind. In doing so, it had trusted a human, another natural adversary. This chain of trust and compassion had created something extraordinary. Looking back, John realized that the true miracle was not just that all of them had survived, but that the experience had revealed nature's capacity for adaptation and empathy. In a world often focused on competition and survival of the fittest, his workshop had become a sanctuary where different species learned to trust and care for each other, proving that sometimes the strongest instinct is not survival, but compassion.